of September 1191, the coast of what is now Israel. The sun rose early and merciless over the plain south of Acre. A column of men, tens of thousands of them, moved through the dust in near silence, broken only by the creak of leather, the scrape of iron on iron, and the rhythmic thud of hooves on dry earth. They were heading south toward a city called Jaffa, and they had been walking for weeks. Then the arrows started. Not a few arrows like a hailstorm, according to one chronicler who walked with that army. They came from the east, from the edge of a forest, from men on horseback who appeared, unleashed their volleys, and vanished into the tree line before the column could respond. Soldiers fell. Men around them closed the gap and kept walking. No one broke formation. No one charged back. This went on for hours. What kind of army does that? What kind of discipline holds together under that kind of sustained, grinding pressure, not for an hour but for days, and doesn't snap? Here is the thing about the Battle of Arsuf that most accounts miss. The real story is not the charge at the end. The real story is what came before the charge. 3 weeks of controlled, deliberate suffering that made the charge possible. And then there is this. Richard the Lionheart won one of the most tactically precise battles of the medieval world at Arsuf, and still did not take Jerusalem. He came within 12 miles, twice, and turned back both times. That paradox, winning perfectly and still falling short of the goal, is what we are going to examine here. Not just what happened on the 7th of September 1191, but why it happened, how it was engineered, where it nearly collapsed, and what it actually meant when the dust settled. We will look at the primary sources from both sides, including the accounts of Baha ad-Din ibn Shaddad Saladin's personal secretary, who rode with the Sultan through the entire campaign and wrote about it in detail. And we will look at what modern military historians have made of those accounts. But to understand Arsuf, you have to go back 4 years, to a disaster that changed everything and that haunted every decision Richard made on that coastal road in 1191. The 4th of July, 1187. The Horns of Hattin, a rocky plateau in Galilee above the Sea of Tiberias. On that day, the largest Crusader field army ever assembled in the Holy Land was destroyed. Not by a direct frontal assault, not by superior numbers overwhelming a defensive position, but by fire, heat, thirst, and a single catastrophic decision that unraveled everything the Crusaders had built in a generation. The army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, under King Guy de Lusignan, had marched out to relieve the siege of Tiberias. Saladin had baited them into open ground. He knew they needed water. He knew the route from their last reliable water source to the lake would take more than a day to cover. He knew what thirst does to men in full armor on an exposed plateau in July in the Levant. His cavalry did not charge them directly. They circled, they fired. They lit the dry scrub brush around the column, filling the air with dense smoke. Through the night and into the second day, the Crusaders were harassed, parched, and half-blinded, and still the lake remained out of reach. What Saladin was doing was not simply attacking them. He was attacking their psychology. He was engineering the conditions under which trained soldiers stop thinking clearly, stop following orders, and start reacting to the most immediate pressure in front of them. At some point, Crusader infantry abandoned the column and charged uphill toward the water they could see but not reach. The formation fractured. The heavy cavalry was cut off from its infantry support, and then it was over. The Crusader field army was effectively annihilated. Guy de Lusignan was captured. The sacred relics the Crusaders carried into battle were taken. Jerusalem fell 3 months later. This is the disaster that made the Third Crusade necessary, and it is the shadow that fell across every decision Richard made in 1191. Because the critical thing to understand about Hattin, the thing that Richard studied and internalized, is that Saladin did not need to be more powerful than his enemy. He needed his enemy to break themselves. He exploited heat, thirst, and the shattering human impulse to do something rather than endure. It was a masterpiece of psychological and tactical warfare built on one fundamental truth. Armies are made of human beings, and human beings have limits. The same man, the same army, the the same tactics. That was what was waiting for Richard on the road south from Acre. The news of Jerusalem's fall reached Europe in late 1187 and struck the continent like a physical blow. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call to arms. 3 of the most powerful rulers in Western Europe took the cross. Friedrich I Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, assembled what was reportedly an enormous force, but drowned while crossing a river in Anatolia in 1190, and his army largely scattered without him. Philippe II Auguste of France made it to the Levant, cold, methodical, a brilliant political operator, and a man who intensely disliked his English counterpart. And Richard I of England, 33 years old, in 1191, a man who had spent most of his adult life fighting or planning to fight, already famous as a commander in the wars of Western Europe, about to become something more than that. The alliance between Richard and Philippe was transactional from the start. They needed each other. They didn't trust each other. That tension ran through the long siege of Acre, which had already dragged on for nearly 2 years when Richard arrived in June 1191. When Acre finally fell in July, a significant and hard-won victory, Philippe almost immediately began organizing his departure. His stated reasons involved health and urgent political matters in France. Richard's private view of this decision was not charitable, and the bitterness between them would echo far beyond the Holy Land. For the purposes of Arsuf, the key fact is simple. After Philippe left, Richard commanded the crusade alone. The success or failure of everything that came next rested entirely on him. If you've been finding this kind of deep, source-based military history worth your time, subscribing keeps you in the conversation. There's no algorithm shortcut for this kind of research, and it helps more than you might think. The fall of Acre on the 12th of July 1191 should have been a moment of uncomplicated triumph. One of the most important port cities in the eastern Mediterranean was back in Crusader hands. The road south was open. Then Richard made a decision that has been argued over for 8 centuries. The terms of Acre's surrender required Saladin to pay a ransom for the garrison, along with the return of Christian prisoners, within a specified period. When those terms were not met to Richard's satisfaction by the deadline, he ordered the execution of the prisoners held in Acre. The sources, both Latin and Arabic, agree that approximately 2,700 men were killed, though they differ on the exact circumstances and the justifications each side offered. By the standards of medieval warfare, such a decision was not without precedent. Richard would have framed it as military necessity. Keeping a large prisoner population was a logistical burden and a potential security problem while preparing to march south. But the strategic consequences extended well beyond the immediate situation. Saladin had used those prisoners as leverage. He had negotiated. He had expected the calculus of medieval war: ransom, exchange, delay to create space for some kind of diplomatic maneuvering. When Richard removed those prisoners from the equation entirely, Saladin lost one of his most useful tools. He also drew a clear conclusion. This opponent does not follow the expected rules. There would be no soft resolution, no withdrawal with honors preserved. This was going to have to be fought to a hard conclusion. Saladin's retaliatory killing of Crusader prisoners he held locked both sides into positions from which there was no easy retreat. The road to Jaffa was not going to be opened by negotiation. It was going to be walked through sustained military pressure. That decision, made in August 1191 outside Acre, set the terms for everything that followed. Here is something the Western retelling of the Third Crusade often underemphasizes. Saladin, in the summer of 1191, was not in a position of uncomplicated strength. Yes, he had destroyed the Crusader field army at Hattin. Yes, he had taken Jerusalem. Yes, he had consolidated more authority over the Islamic world than any leader in a generation. But that consolidation was fragile in ways that don't always make it into the popular telling. The coalition he led, Egyptian Ayyubids, Turkish cavalry commanders, Kurdish officers, Syrian emirs, was not a unified national force. It was a set of relationships held together by Saladin's personal prestige, by the religious energy of the jihad he had framed this as, and by the expectation of continued success. Political prestige in any system is expensive to maintain and cheap to lose. In the political culture of 12th century Islamic leadership, a sultan who allowed an enemy army to march unmolested through the heart of his territory was a sultan whose vassals would start reconsidering their loyalties. He had to be seen to fight. He had to fight effectively. And ideally, he had to produce results. This explains the choices Saladin made in the weeks between Acre and Arsuf. He committed his cavalry to a sustained harassment campaign, not because it was the only option available, but because it was the option that let him demonstrate active resistance while waiting for the Crusader formation to give him an opening. He was under pressure from the logic of his own position. He wasn't acting from dominance. He was acting from necessity. Richard, for his part, understood something that impatient voices in his army and armchair strategists throughout history have tended to miss. Jerusalem was not the first problem. Jerusalem sits roughly 50 kilometers inland from the coast, through the Judean hills, broken terrain with no reliable supply route, against an opponent who controlled the surrounding country. An army that marched straight into those hills from the coast would be walking into a version of Hattin. No fleet to resupply them, no flat ground to maintain formation, passes where Saladin's cavalry could work on them at leisure. Jaffa first. Always Jaffa first. From Jaffa, a coastal city with a harbor, the fleet could anchor and deliver supplies on a continuous basis. From Jaffa, the road toward Jerusalem could be organized and supplied. From Jaffa, there was a fortified base that didn't depend on an exposed overland line back to Acre. The route from Acre to Jaffa was roughly 120 kilometers, running south along the coastal plain, flat and open, with the sea on the right and forested hills on the left. The fleet would sail in parallel. Every evening, the army would camp near the shore to receive fresh supplies from the ships. It was an elegant design. It had one unavoidable vulnerability. The 120 kilometers between Acre and Jaffa were not open ground. Saladin's cavalry could harass the left flank of the column every single day for the entire length of the march. And if he could accomplish what he had accomplished at Hattin, if he could find the threshold at which human endurance breaks, find the moment when one section of the formation charged without authorization and fractured the whole, then the road to Jaffa would end the same way the road to Tiberias had ended. Richard was walking deliberately into the scenario his enemy had designed for him. He knew it. His entire plan rested on a single answer to that scenario: hold the formation, no matter what. If you want to understand the Battle of Arsuf, you have to understand how Richard organized his march. Because what he assembled was not simply a column of soldiers moving from one point to another. It was a tactical system engineered to neutralize the specific threat he faced. Think of it in terms of the problem. Saladin's most effective weapon was the Turkish horse archer. These were soldiers trained from childhood in the traditions of Central Asian steppe warfare, riding at speed, shooting composite bows with genuine accuracy at full gallop, and retreating before the enemy could engage at close range. They could inflict casualties without accepting significant risk themselves. They could maintain pressure for hours. At Hattin, against opponents who lacked a coherent response, they had been effectively unstoppable. Richard's answer was architecture. The column moved with the sea on its right flank, protected by the fleet, which brought supplies, water, and fresh equipment, and took on wounded men throughout the march. On the landward side, facing the direction of attack, Richard deployed his infantry, tightly packed, shields angled outward, with crossbowmen positioned along the outer edge. The crossbow was a slower weapon than the composite bow, slower to reload, shorter effective range on horseback. But at close range, it punched through the leather armor most horse archers wore. It was enough to make charging in close genuinely costly. And inside that protective ring of infantry, shielded from direct fire, Richard kept his heavy cavalry, the knights, the hospitallers, the templars, the mounted sergeants, resting, relative to the infantry, holding their horses' strength, ready. The logic was clean. The infantry absorbs the arrow storm. The cavalry waits. When, if the moment comes, the cavalry strikes, not in pursuit of individual riders, which would destroy the formation. In a concentrated charge, at the right moment, against opponents who are close enough that they cannot simply evade. One rule governed all of this, and Richard issued it clearly before the march began. No one leaves the formation without direct orders, not to pursue, not to answer an attack, not to avenge a fallen comrade, not for any reason. That rule was the entire plan. The fleet was the infrastructure, the formation was the weapon, and the rule was what held the weapon together. The fleet itself deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts of Arsuf. Ships sailing along the coast can sound like background detail. They were not. An army of this size cannot sustain itself in late summer in the Levant by living off the land. The water sources along the coastal plain were limited and unreliable. The heat in September was severe, not uncomfortably warm, but genuinely dangerous for men in iron armor covering miles of ground each day. The combination of physical effort, dehydration, and heat stress was already pushing men toward their physiological limits before Saladin's cavalry arrived each morning to add the psychological dimension. Every evening, the column camped near the shore. Ships came in to offload food, water, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Wounded were transferred onto the ships to recover. The fleet didn't supplement the march. It made the march survivable, and this created a specific problem for Saladin's strategy. He could harass the left flank of the column relentlessly, but he had no meaningful naval force to threaten the right. His harassment campaign was constrained to a single axis of attack. Richard had already partially solved his tactical problem simply by never moving far from the coast. What Saladin could do what he did, with remarkable persistence, was work on that left flank, day after day, until something gave. The march south from Acre began in late August of 1191. It was deliberately slow. The column moved carefully, stopping early enough each afternoon to establish a defensible camp before dark. Richard understood that a hurried march was a vulnerable march, and a vulnerable march was exactly what Saladin needed. From the first day, the attacks came. Saladin's cavalry, primarily his Turkish horse archers, struck the landward flank every morning. They would ride in, loose several volleys, and pull back before the crossbowmen could engage them effectively. They were fast, they were disciplined, and they did not stop. The chronicle, written by participants on the Crusader side, known as the Itinerarium Peregrinorum, describes the arrows falling like a hailstorm. Medieval battle chronicles have a tendency toward the dramatic, and we should read that kind of imagery with appropriate caution. But even accounting for literary embellishment, the physical reality was severe. Men were being hit. Men were dying. The soldiers at the outer edge of the column, the ones absorbing the fire while the cavalry inside stayed protected, walked through this every day. The Itinerarium records, at one point, a pack animal killed during the march. The chronicler noted that the animal had 16 arrows in it. Whether that precise count is accurate, we cannot say with certainty, but it communicates something real about the density and duration of the fire the column was absorbing. What the Itinerarium also records, and this is the detail that illuminates the entire campaign, is that some soldiers walked the march with arrows embedded in their armor, not necessarily penetrating deeply into flesh. In every case, the padded layers beneath a coat of mail could stop a shaft from going through. But the arrows were there, in the outer layers of armor, and the men carrying them did not stop to remove them. They were not permitted to stop. They kept walking. This was Richard's fundamental gamble. He was betting that his army's collective discipline would outlast Saladin's patience and his cavalry's ability to maintain sustained pressure. He was also asking himself and asking his commanders to do something extraordinarily difficult: watch men taking casualties and issue no order to respond. He spent those weeks riding the length of the column himself. Not from a protected central position, but along the outer side of the formation, close to the fighting, where he could assess the condition of his infantry and make adjustments in real time. The visibility of a commander in those circumstances is not ceremonial. Soldiers who can see that their king is in the same heat, under the same sky, absorbing the same risk, will hold a little longer, not indefinitely, but a little longer. The march covered roughly 8 to 10 miles on a good day, less on difficult ones. 3 weeks in, the column was approaching the stretch of coast near the town of Arsuf. To understand why Saladin believed his campaign would eventually work, you have to go back to Hattin, because Hattin didn't succeed by accident. It succeeded because Saladin understood a specific structural vulnerability in how Crusader armies fought. The Crusader tactical system was built around the shock charge of heavy cavalry. It was devastatingly effective in the right circumstances: armored knights on armored horses at full speed against infantry in open ground. The problem was that this weapon only functioned when the cavalry could charge in a coordinated formation. Isolated charges by individual units, without support, against mobile cavalry who could simply ride away those accomplished nothing and exhausted horses. Crusader armies had lost battles before by doing exactly that. What Saladin had discovered at Hattin, and what he was now replicating along the coastal road, was a method of creating the conditions under which Crusader cavalry made that mistake. You put men under enough sustained pressure, enough heat, enough thirst, enough watching brothers die without being permitted to answer, and eventually someone will break. When one section charges without orders, a gap appears in the formation. Other units follow. The formation fractures, and fractured heavy cavalry is not a weapon. It's a series of individual men on progressively more tired horses, separated from their infantry support, in terrain where Saladin's riders can pick them apart at leisure. The plan was sound. The mechanism was proven. The only variable Saladin may not have fully weighted was the specific quality of the opponent he was now facing. By the evening of September 6th, the column had reached the edge of the forested area near Arsuf. The terrain here worked in Saladin's favor. The trees came closer to the coastline than they had for much of the march, which meant his cavalry could emerge at shorter range and hit the column with less warning. The distance they had to cover to reach effective arrow range was reduced. The time the crossbowmen had to respond was shortened. He had been watching the column for 3 weeks. He had seen it absorb pressure day after day without fracturing. He had also seen the rear guard, the Hospitallers, absorbing the heaviest punishment of any unit in the formation. On the evening of the 6th, he made a decision. Tomorrow would not be another day of sustained harassment. Tomorrow he would bring his full force into the engagement and push until something broke. On the Crusader side that same evening, Richard issued his orders for the following day. The column would move in the same formation it had maintained since Acre. The infantry would hold the landward flank. The cavalry would remain inside. No one would break formation to pursue. No one would charge without a direct signal from command. He gave particular attention to the rear guard. In a column under sustained attack, the rear position is the most exposed. The front of the column sets the pace and receives the first contact. The rear catches everything that falls behind, absorbs the most concentrated fire, and is farthest from command and from any coordinated response. The Hospitallers had held the rear of this column for 3 weeks. They had taken casualties every day. They had watched comrades fall and held their position anyway. The Hospitallers were not ordinary soldiers. They were members of a military religious order, warrior monks who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and who had dedicated their lives to combat in defense of the Christian presence in the Holy Land. They were among the most experienced and most disciplined fighters in the Crusader force. They were also men of extraordinary personal pride, the kind of pride that made standing still while your order was dismembered around you not just painful but a kind of spiritual wound. According to the itinerarium, the master of the hospital, identified in that text as Garnier de Nablus, went to Richard before the march resumed and asked for permission to charge. His men were being killed piecemeal. They could not answer. He wanted leave to respond. Richard told him to hold. Whatever the Hospitallers were feeling that night, exhaustion, grief, controlled fury, they set it aside. They would ride in the rear again the following morning. They would take what came. They would hold. They had been holding for 3 weeks. The question was whether 3 weeks was the limit. The 7th of September 1191. Before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the Crusader column was moving. The morning light came low and pale across the coastal plain, casting long shadows from the column's own ranks. The sea lay quiet to the right. The forest, dark and dense, lined the east. The air still held a trace of the nighttime cool, but everyone in that column knew from experience, from the weeks accumulated behind them, that by mid-morning the iron would be hot to the touch and the dust would coat the inside of the throat. They didn't have to wait for mid-morning. Saladin's cavalry appeared with the early light, not the small probing parties of previous days, more of them, in greater density, pressing in from multiple angles. He had ordered his full cavalry into the engagement, and the pressure on the left flank climbed quickly. Arrows came in from the forest's edge, from riders swinging wide to approach from the south, from horsemen who appeared through the dust and then were gone. The infantry at the outer edge raised their shields and kept moving. The crossbowmen shot back where they had openings. The column kept moving. What you have to hold in mind about a column under this kind of fire is that it is not a passive situation. The men at the edges are walking a continuous decision to absorb what's coming, to stay in their assigned position, to not react. Every step forward is that decision made again. Every step. Across hours of time, by thousands of individuals simultaneously. That kind of collective discipline does not happen by accident, and it does not sustain itself automatically. It requires every individual to make the same choice, over and over, often while watching the person beside them make a different choice permanently. The column kept moving. Saladin had also committed to a psychological component. His forces used war drums and signal horns throughout the engagement, a wall of sound along the eastern flank, calculated to communicate scale and intensity to soldiers who could hear the size of the force opposing them without being able to see all of it through the dust and the trees. The itinerarium describes the noise as continuous, overlaid on the percussion of arrows against shields and the grinding movement of thousands of feet on dry ground. The column absorbed it. It kept moving. By mid-morning, the nature of the attack had shifted. The horse archers were still present and still active, but Saladin had also brought heavier cavalry forward, men who could press closer to the formation, whose horses could sustain more punishment if the crossbowmen did find their range. The pressure on the Hospitaller rear guard, already the most exposed position in the march, became something qualitatively different from the harassment of previous days. And the question forming in the minds of the men in that column, a question that had been forming for weeks but that now carried a new urgency, was a simple one. When? Because the plan was not simply defensive. Somewhere in this march there had to be an end to the endurance. The cavalry inside the column had been preserved at considerable cost, protected by the infantry suffering around them, rested relative to men who had been walking for weeks, and that preservation had a purpose. The purpose was a charge. Everyone knew it was coming. The only question was the timing. Richard understood the timing problem with precise clarity. Charge too early when the enemy's cavalry is spread wide, mobile, not yet committed to close contact, and the heavy knights drive into open ground where horse archers simply ride away. You pursue. The formation stretches. Horses tire, and then scattered Crusader cavalry, on exhausted horses, separated from their infantry, faces an enemy that has been waiting for exactly this. That is how Crusader armies died. Arsuf was not going to be another Hattin because Richard was not going to make that mistake. The only way a charge by heavy cavalry works against this enemy is when they are close enough and concentrated enough that they cannot evade cleanly. You need them within the kill radius before you commit. You need the entire cavalry force to hit simultaneously, not sections, not individuals, but a coordinated mass moving in unison at the moment of contact. And then you need to stop and reform before the pursuit instinct destroys what the charge achieved. Richard was waiting for that geometry. And while he waited, the Hospitallers at the rear were paying for the wait with their blood. According to the itinerarium, a source written from the Crusader perspective, and one that we should read with awareness of its bias, Garnier de Nablus rode forward a second time and made his request again. His men were taking losses they could not sustain. They were being killed in their positions. He needed leave to respond. Richard refused. Not yet. This refusal is one of the most discussed decisions in the entire battle. From a human standpoint, it reads as almost inhuman coldness. The Hospitallers had held the most dangerous position in this formation for 3 weeks. They were warrior monks whose entire purpose was combat in defense of this cause, and they were being ordered to stand in place and absorb punishment while their order bled around them. From a tactical standpoint, the refusal was exactly right. The geometry wasn't there yet. The enemy hadn't compressed into the configuration that would make a charge decisive. A charge at that moment would likely be a charge into insufficient density, and a partially successful charge that then had to pull back would fracture the rear of the column and give Saladin the opening he had been working toward. Richard held. The Hospitallers held. Then 2 of them didn't. The itinerarium names them, though historians note that medieval chronicles often get such details wrong or conflate separate accounts. One identified as Baudouin de Caron, another described as a Hospitaller marshal. Whether it was exactly those 2 men who broke first, or whether the itinerarium's identification is entirely accurate, we cannot state with certainty. What the sources agree on is the basic sequence. A small number of Hospitallers broke from the rear of the formation and charged the enemy without orders. And then the rear guard followed them. Not because they were undisciplined men, not because they panicked, because there is a threshold, and those men had reached it. They were fighters trained from early life for exactly this kind of combat, and they had been forbidden to use that training while watching their order dismembered around them. When the first men committed, the decision available to the others changed instantly. It was no longer a choice between holding and charging. It was a choice between abandoning brothers who had just committed to something irreversible, or going with them. They went. The rear of the column fractured. A gap opened. Saladin's cavalry, which had been pressing close to the Hospitaller position and looking for exactly this kind of opening, began moving into it. On any other battlefield, in any other battle, with any other commander responding to this situation, this is where the account ends. The gap becomes a breach, the breach becomes a rout, and the rout becomes what happened at Hattin. Richard saw it happen. He did not panic. This is the moment that defines Arsuf. Not the charge commander's order charges. What was extraordinary was the recognition, in an instant, under conditions of enormous pressure, that the thing he had spent 3 weeks trying to prevent could be redirected. The Hospitallers had charged. That fact was fixed. You cannot recall a commitment made by fighting men on a medieval battlefield. The question was no longer whether the charge would happen. It was already happening, but whether it would be a catastrophe or a weapon. And the answer to that question depended entirely on what Richard did in the next 30 seconds. He gave the order. All cavalry. Attack. 3 divisions, simultaneously, across the width of the formation. Now. Not a single unit chasing after the Hospitallers. Not a reactive response to a crisis. A coordinated strike on all sectors of the engaged line, timed to the moment when Saladin's cavalry, which had been pressing in close to exploit the Hospitaller break, was within range and without time to reorganize into a defensive position. Richard had been watching the enemy's disposition all morning. He knew where they were concentrated. He had been waiting for a moment when that concentration was close enough and dense enough that a charge would hit them before they could pull back. The Hospitallers had given him that moment, not as he had planned, but it was the moment. The cavalry came off the column. Medieval accounts of cavalry charges have a tendency to slip into the heroic register. Perfect formations, gleaming armor, individual acts of valor. The physical reality was faster and noisier and more chaotic than that. A charge by heavy cavalry is an event you heard before. You fully saw thousands of pounds of armored men and warhorses accelerating across dry ground. The sound building, from a low, sustained vibration to something that you felt in the chest, closing the distance to the target in seconds. Saladin's cavalry, which had been in the attack posture moving forward, shooting, moving forward again, had no time to form a coordinated defensive response. The gap between contact and impact was too short. The charge hit them. Bahar ad-Din ibn Shaddad, who was present with Saladin's forces that day, and who wrote about the battle in his memoir of the Sultan's life, records that Saladin rode along his own lines at this moment, attempting to rally his cavalry and hold them in position. He moved along the engaged front, visible to his men, trying to impose his authority on the situation. He could not stop the withdrawal. This is not the same as saying Saladin's army collapsed. It did not. His forces pulled back in stages rather than breaking entirely. But the units that had been pressing most closely against the Hospitaller position, the ones caught at close range when the charge came, were driven back, and Baha ad-Din's account makes clear that Saladin was unable to hold the line he had committed to. The Crusader knights drove forward. They pushed the first wave of Ayyubid cavalry back from the position it had been working to penetrate. And then Richard sounded the recall. Come back, reform, now. The instinct, after a successful charge, is pursuit. You chase the retreating enemy. You ride them down. This instinct is powerful and sometimes tactically correct. It is also how armies destroy themselves at the moment of apparent victory, by shattering their formation in pursuit of opponents who are fast enough in open terrain to simply ride away and then turn back on the scattered, exhausted pursuers. Richard called it before the pursuit instinct could take hold. The cavalry came back. They reformed on the column. This, the recall, the reformation, the refusal to let the charge dissolve into pursuit, was in some ways as remarkable as the charge itself. It required the same discipline from the cavalry that the infantry had been exercising for 3 weeks. Don't react. Follow the order. Trust the plan. Saladin reorganized. He was too experienced a commander and too proud a man to treat the morning's events as final. He still had cavalry. He still had reserves. He ordered a second push, bringing heavier cavalry forward to blunt any further Crusader charge and regain the momentum of the engagement. The second Crusader charge met this force. It was more organized than the first, because Richard now had his cavalry assembled in sequence rather than responding to an unexpected break. The Ayyubid cavalry that came forward was struck by knights in coordinated movement, and it did not hold. The attacks continued through the afternoon, at reduced but still significant intensity. But the shape of the day had been established in those critical minutes around the first charge. Saladin's tactical mechanism, pressure until formation breaks, exploit the break, had met its limit. The formation had broken, and the commander on the other side had used the break as the weapon, not the vulnerability. By late afternoon, Saladin ordered a withdrawal. The sources on this point are careful, and so should we be. Baha ad-Din does not describe a rout. Saladin's army withdrew in recognizable order. His cavalry was not destroyed. His command structure was intact. His strategic options in the weeks ahead were not eliminated by what had happened at Arsuf. He had lost the battle. He had not lost his army or the war. What he had lost was the day, and, with it, the initiative on the coastal road. The Crusader column marched into Arsuf in the late afternoon of the 7th of September, 1191. The accounts describe no great celebration. The men were exhausted. Many were wounded. Some had died. The column had held, had charged, had held again, and it was still an army. That was what mattered. 3 days later, on September 10th, Jaffa opened its gates. The road to Jerusalem was open. The battlefield's human cost at Arsuf is a question that the historical record answers poorly, and it deserves honest treatment. For the Crusader side, the chronicles describe losses as significant but not catastrophic. The rear guard had absorbed the heaviest punishment, but precise figures are absent from even the most detailed contemporary accounts. For Saladin's forces, the figures in the Latin sources should be treated with genuine skepticism. Medieval battle chronicles routinely inflated enemy casualties as a way of magnifying a victory's significance. Some numbers cited in various accounts are almost certainly exaggerations by any reasonable military analysis. Baha ad-Din acknowledges the defeat and describes losses, but does not provide specific numbers. Modern historians, including David Nicole in his detailed study of the Third Crusade, treat the higher Latin figures as unreliable. What we can say with confidence is this: Saladin retained a functioning army. He had not been destroyed at Arsuf the way the Crusaders had been destroyed at Hattin. He had options. 3 days after the battle, Jaffa fell without a major siege. The Ayyubid garrison, understanding that the field army could not currently support a defense, did not attempt one. Richard had his port. He had his base. The fleet anchored. Supplies came ashore. Jerusalem was 50 kilometers away. In the days following Arsuf, Saladin made a decision that reveals exactly how clearly he was reading the situation. He ordered the demolition of Ascalon. Ascalon was a coastal city south of Jaffa. In Crusader hands, it would have been a base that threatened Saladin's line of communication between Egypt and Syria, the axis on which his whole strategic position depended. Rather than attempt to defend it with forces, he wasn't confident he could hold in place against Richard's demonstrated capabilities. He ordered it torn down. The walls came apart. The harbour was rendered unusable. It was a ruthless and cold-eyed choice. He was surrendering territory that had real value in order to deny Richard a tool. Baha ad-Din describes Saladin in this period as genuinely troubled by Arsuf, not broken, not despairing, but reassessing. He had expected the harassment campaign to fracture the Crusader column. The fact that it hadn't, until the very last moment, and that even that fracture had been turned into a weapon by the man he was facing, meant he was up against something different from what he had prepared for. He could still deny Richard Jerusalem. The Judean hills offered terrain that worked against the Crusader tactical system the way the coastal plain had worked for it. No fleet, no flat ground, passes where Saladin's cavalry could impose costs that Richard could not sustain. He began the work of fortifying those approaches. And so, the decision that no account of Arsuf can avoid. In the autumn and winter of 1191, and again in the summer of 1192, Richard's army advanced toward Jerusalem, twice. The first time, they reached a point roughly 12 miles from the city before Richard ordered a halt and, after deliberation, a withdrawal. The second time, they came closer still. According to one account which historians treat with some uncertainty, Richard covered his eyes rather than look at a city he had not yet decided he could take. He turned back again. The reasons he gave were logistical and political, and modern military historians have largely endorsed them. The Judean hills offered no coast, no fleet, no reliable supply line for a besieging army. Jerusalem was heavily fortified and had been reinforced. A siege that failed to conclude before Saladin could threaten the Crusader line of retreat back to Jaffa could end the same way Hattin had ended an isolated army, cut off from supplies, fighting at a disadvantage in unfavorable terrain. Arsuf would mean nothing if Jerusalem became the site of a second Hattin. There was also England to consider. Richard had received word that his brother John was moving against his political interests at home. Philippe of France was preparing to take advantage of the king's extended absence. Every additional month in the Holy Land was a month of political exposure he could not afford indefinitely. And the crusade itself was not internally unified. Disputes about who would govern Jerusalem if it were retaken, arguments between factions that had never resolved after Philippe's departure, disputes about resources and strategy. These pressures were real, and they complicated any decision Richard made. He was a practical man. He had won at Arsuf with precise execution. He was not willing to throw that victory away in a siege that the evidence, as he assessed it, suggested carried too high a risk of catastrophic failure. Whether he was right, whether a determined assault on Jerusalem in the autumn of 1191 might have succeeded, is a question historians continue to debate. There are serious scholars on both sides of it. What we can say is that the decision not to attack was not cowardice, it was calculation. Whether the calculation was correct is a separate question, and one that does not resolve cleanly. In September of 1192, a year after Arsuf, Richard and Saladin signed the Treaty of Jaffa. The Crusaders would keep the coastal cities they had taken. Christians would be permitted to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem freely. The city itself would remain under Saladin's control. Richard left the Holy Land in October of 1192. He never returned. On the plain near Arsuf, in the hours after the armies left, a medieval battlefield did what all battlefields do. It went quiet. The dust settled slowly, drifting east on the sea wind. The afternoon light shifted from white to amber. The ground was churned and marked by the passage of thousands of men and horses, and the violence of an entire day. The sounds that had filled the air, drums, horns, shouted commands in Arabic and French and English, the percussion of iron against iron, were gone. What remained was the Mediterranean wind, coming in as it always does along that coast. Somewhere in the army, marching into Arsuf that evening, a soldier was still wearing armor with an arrow embedded in the outer layers. He had not stopped to remove it during the march. He had been ordered to hold the line. He had held. He didn't know yet what it meant that he had made it to Arsuf. He didn't know about the treaty that would come a year later, or about the 2 marches toward Jerusalem that would turn back short of the goal. He knew that he was alive. He knew the column had held. And he knew, because it was obvious in the way the evening settled over the plain, that the battle was over. For the moment, that was all he needed to know. Saladin and Richard never met in person, though they communicated through intermediaries during the long negotiations that followed Arsuf and Jaffa. Contemporary accounts on both sides suggest a mutual respect that seems almost improbable given the stakes, but that appears too consistently in the sources to dismiss. The Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192, was a compromise neither side would have chosen freely. The Crusaders had come to take Jerusalem. They had not. Saladin had come to prevent the Crusaders from re-establishing themselves on the Levantine coast. He had not fully done that either. What the treaty represented was the realistic limit of what either side could force on the other. And both men, practical enough by then to recognize that limit, signed it. Saladin died in March of 1193, 6 months after the treaty, less than 18 months after Arsuf. He had spent himself in those years. The accounts describe a man who had given away most of his personal fortune in charity and left almost nothing to his heirs. His empire, held together so largely by his personal authority and the momentum of his jihad, fragmented quickly after his death. The coalition he had built over a lifetime did not survive him by many years. Richard was captured on his way home, seized by Duke Leopold of Austria, whom he had publicly humiliated during the Crusade, and held for a large ransom for over a year. He returned to England in 1194, spent his remaining years fighting in France, and died in 1199 from a wound sustained during a minor siege. He was 41 years old. What Arsuf demonstrated at the level of military practice is worth examining carefully, because it is specific and it is instructive. It proved that the Turkish horse archer system, the system that had destroyed the Crusader field army at Hattin, and that had been the dominant tactical instrument in the Islamic military tradition for decades, could be defeated by a correctly organized march formation, given sufficient discipline and sufficient logistical support. The fleet was not peripheral to that conclusion. Without a reliable source of water and supplies on the seaward flank, the infantry could not have absorbed 3 weeks of sustained fire without breaking. The tactical victory at Arsuf was built on a logistical foundation that Richard had engineered before the first arrow flew. It also proved something more difficult to quantify about the relationship between commanders and the people they command. Richard asked thousands of soldiers to do something that violated every warrior instinct they had to take fire without answering it, and they did it for 3 weeks. Not because they were automatons, because the system Richard had built made sense to them, and because the man giving the order was visibly sharing the conditions he was imposing on them. Leadership in those circumstances is not simply issuing correct instructions. It is being present under the same sky, in the same heat, under the same arrows, so that the people you are asking to do the hard thing can see that you understand what you are asking. And what Saladin was forced to absorb in the days after Arsuf, ordering the demolition of Ascalon, reorganizing his forces, beginning the fortification of the Judean hills, is the limit of a tactical system that depends on inducing an enemy's mistake. When the enemy doesn't make the mistake, the system's exposure becomes visible. You have committed cavalry to close contact with an opponent whose strength lies in exactly that close contact. The advantages that made the system effective, mobility, distance, psychological pressure, disappear precisely when you push hard enough to create the opening you need. Three things about Arsuf tend to get misunderstood, and they are worth correcting briefly. The first is that Richard was reckless or impulsive. He was the opposite. The charge at Arsuf was a calculated decision made in a compressed window of time, based on weeks of observing the enemy's tactics and waiting for the geometry to be right. Recklessness would have been charging on the first day. What Richard did required more discipline than recklessness ever does. The second is that the Hospitallers who broke formation were guilty of a catastrophic error narrowly averted. They were not. They had held longer than any reasonable expectation required, in the most dangerous position in the formation, watching their order absorb punishment for 3 weeks. When they finally broke, their commander responded in a way that turned the break into a decisive weapon. The credit for Arsuf belongs to both. To the men who held the line past its limit, and to the commander who was ready for the moment when it finally gave. The third, and perhaps the most persistent, is that the Third Crusade was simply a failure. It was not. It recovered the entire Levantine coastline. It created conditions under which the Crusader states survived for another century. Richard did not take Jerusalem. He did prevent the complete collapse of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, which, given the state that presence was in after Hattin, was not a negligible achievement. History is not entirely fair to complexity. Richard the Lionheart became one of the most celebrated warrior kings in the English tradition, a figure who appears in the literature and imagination of subsequent centuries as the archetype of the chivalric fighter. What the legend tends to lose is the cold precision of the man, the planner, the architect of formations. The person who rode the length of his column in September heat and told his most capable troops to absorb arrows without responding, because he had read the situation clearly enough to know it was necessary. The courage at Arsuf was not the charge. The courage was 3 weeks of controlled patience while men died around him. Saladin became, in the Western tradition, something unusual, an adversary who commanded genuine admiration from his opponents. His keeping of terms, his reported generosity, his treatment of civilian populations, these were recorded by the people he was fighting against as much as by his own side. The later crusading literature gave him a strange status, as though the story needed him to be worthy of the man he was fighting. Both reputations have layers of legend, accumulated over centuries. Both men were products of their time, capable of brutal decisions, operating within frameworks of violence that we would find repugnant today. What they shared, oddly, was a certain clarity about the limits of what military force can accomplish. Saladin did not lose Arsuf because he lacked courage or skill. He lost it because the specific system he was applying met an opponent who had designed his march specifically to defeat it. Richard did not take Jerusalem not because he lacked the will. He turned back because he understood, in the months after Arsuf, that winning battles and winning campaigns are not the same thing, and that a campaign won at the wrong price might produce a defeat that looked like a victory until the moment it collapsed. That may be the deepest thing either of them understood about war. Along the coast of what is now central Israel, between Netanya and Herzliya, there are highways and apartment buildings and shopping centers and the ordinary noise of the contemporary world. The coastal plain is flat, as it always was. The sea is where it always was. The hills are to the east, as they were on the morning of the 7th of September 1191. There is no monument to the Battle of Arsuf that most visitors would notice. There are archaeological remains from the ancient city. The Romans called it Apollonia, but the battlefield itself left no permanent marks on the landscape that 8 centuries of continuous occupation haven't covered or replaced. The wind still comes in off the Mediterranean in September. It would have felt familiar to anyone who walked that coast in 1191. The salt smell. The particular quality of the afternoon light on water. The way the heat begins to ease as the sun drops toward the horizon. Somewhere along this coast, a soldier once walked with arrows in his armor because he had been ordered to hold the line, and he held it. He didn't know he was creating a moment that military historians would still be examining 800 years later. He didn't know about the treaty, or the marches that turned back short of Jerusalem, or the long argument about whether Richard's decision was genius or failure. He knew the formation, he knew the order, he held. That might be the most honest thing we can say about Arsuf. Beneath the grand sweep of the Crusades, beneath the religious stakes and the political calculations and the clash of strategic systems, at the center of this battle is something simpler. A very large number of ordinary people, in extraordinary heat, under sustained fire, chose to keep holding the line. And for one afternoon, for a few critical hours, that was enough. The question Arsuf leaves us with is not really about Richard or Saladin, about the Crusades or Jerusalem, about who won or who deserved to win. The question is this: what is the difference between discipline that makes a decisive victory possible and discipline that is simply endurance, admirable, costly, but not sufficient on its own to change the outcome? Because Richard's army had both at Arsuf. They held. The charge succeeded. Jaffa fell. And Jerusalem stayed beyond reach. Was that failure? Was it success? Was it simply the most that the situation allowed? 800 years later, I don't think there is a clean answer. The absence of a clean answer is, I think, exactly why this story is still worth telling. Drop a comment before you go. I want to know where you land on this. Richard won at Arsuf and chose not to attack Jerusalem. Brilliant strategist or flawed crusader? Those are your two options. Tell me which one. If this video helped you see a corner of the medieval world more clearly, the tactics, the decisions, the human cost behind the history hit like. It helps more people find this channel, and it lets us know this kind of deep dive is worth doing. And if you want more of this, the battles that shaped the ancient and medieval world, examined through the sources and the terrain and the decisions, subscribe. There is a lot more of this coming. Thanks for being here. I'll see you in the next one.